All right. Hello, everyone. I have a very interesting guest for you today. Mr. Aakar Patel has been a journalist and is the former head of Amnesty India. He is also most recently the author of The Price of Modi Years and of Our Hindu Rashtra, both of which I highly recommend and both of which we'll be talking about today. So welcome, Mr. Patel.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I wanted to ask you first because you've been around for a while, and because my generation basically grew up with the Hindutva. I was I think around 12 or 13 when Mr. Modi became the prime minister, and that was also the time I became politically aware. But you've been around ever since this started. The movement in Ayodhya took space. Did you see this coming? What was your first reaction to when the Hindutva movement started? Did you in any way sense that this is going to be the inevitable consequences of that?
No, I was 18 in 1988 in college when Shauri came to Baroda and spoke about the temple. I had not heard about the movement till then. And when it happened and when the mosque was pulled down, none of us, well, at least I didn't feel, and the circle that I was moving around didn't feel that this was momentous in some way. I grew up in Surat in a fairly conservative middle class space where though I did have access to friends who were Muslims, there was no real mingling of communities. Surat is very ghettoized, as are most cities in India, and so the Muslims are segregated. I was 21 when the mosque was pulled down, or 22 perhaps, and the day after it was pulled down, I went to the office, which was shut. The market was shut. I was working with my father, and it didn't occur to me that what had happened the day before, which was the 6th of December, would be so meaningful in the history of this country in a negative way. So to go back to what you asked, no, I didn't see this coming when I was your age. It sort of crept up on those of us who were not particularly politically aware.
So was it a sense of sadness, or was it a sense of like celebration? What was your reaction to the Hindutva ideology in general?
Well, I think the point at which I felt that there was something very seriously wrong was in 2002, and I was 32 years old then, and I really ought to have known better. But I moved from Surat to Bombay for work, and in my years in journalism, I began to appreciate more what it was that this sort of thinking was doing to the country and where the country was headed ultimately. Many of us thought that Gujarat was an aberration in the sense that it was episodic, it was limited to that state, and many of us also assumed that it would remain in that state. And what had happened over the decades in terms of one riot and then one sort of pogrom and then another one dislocated from the first. That was the sense in which I saw it at first.
Well, how do you make sense of the political landscape of the country right now? Because to me, it seems like the political landscape of the world that we apply to European countries or American countries is very different from the landscape that we apply to Indian parties, the Congress or the BJP, because the left-right distinction sort of doesn't, make sense in the Indian context. And you mentioned that in the initial pages of your book. So how do you see the divide between the Congress and the BJP? Is it similar to the left-right distinction? Is it ideological? What is the crucial difference?
I would say that the political landscape of India is quite primitive, and that voting tends to happen on confessional grounds. People tend to vote for identity, whether that is caste or whether that is faith for the most part. I suppose linguistic and regional also for the lesser part. But if we look at political ideology elsewhere in the democratic world, where we say that there are specific issues on, say, economics that divide two large formations, whether it is the role of the state or whether it is how much of a welfare state should the government operate. We don't have that in India. So you've got commonality between the BJP on such things as, let's say, national security, where both of them are quite hawkish in the way that they look at borders. Both of them refuse to speak to Pakistan. Both the parties have had a problem with China. If you look at things like, let's say, the welfare state in India to the extent that it exists, the giving out of free grain to people, making sure that fuel is subsidized, and so on. There's not that much to separate the BJP from the Congress. I think the real divisions come in the manner in which they ask for votes. So the BJP specifically aims itself against a particular part of Indian society, which makes it unique in, well, I suppose not unique because this happened in Germany as well, but nationalisms tend to be outward focused for the most part. When you have nationalisms, you have an external enemy that you unify the country on the basis of. What's happening in India, and to some extent what's happening also in the rest of South Asia and has happened, is that we are using our own people and gathering energy in the majority, which is aimed at that smaller part of the country, which I suppose the world has noticed, but it does separate us from democracies, say, in the West, in Europe and the US.
Right. So when it comes to like identities, it seems to me like the BJP is on more firm ideological ground, like it has a better ideological base than the Congress, which seems to like just advocate for what the majority of people believe in, or put its hat on the popularity of its leader. The BJP, on the other hand, has had some consistency when it comes to ideology, that is the Hindutva, things like that. So would you consider the BJP to be, or Hindutva to be a consistent ideology? And what would be your definition of Hindutva, something which has remained consistent from its origin to today?
So I don't know if I would specifically refer to the BJP as an ideological party. I think the dictionary would say that an ideology is a system of ideas that forms economic or a political theory. There is nothing economically consistent in what the BJP has said through the decades. So I've written about this in my book, and we can go into it at some depth if you want. But there is no real consistency on that front with the party, and it could be seen externally as extremely socialist when it felt the need to express that part to itself. It could be seen, or it was seen, as being laissez-faire in terms of its economics just before Mr. Modi took power. So there is no real consistency there. There is a consistency in the sense that if you ask what it is that Hindutva seeks to achieve, and because this word is rarely used by the BJP itself in its formal documents, we have to ask ourselves how the BJP views Hindutva. And I think that we have clues available to us in both the way that they act and what they have said. So in terms of actions, we can see that out of the 303 Lok Sabha MPs, none is a Muslim. In the previous Lok Sabha, they had 282 MPs, none of whom was a Muslim. There was a study done by the Hindu a couple of years ago, which showed that of about 1,100 members of legislative assembly across the country, the BJP had one Muslim, which was the deputy speaker of Assam. I don't think he's there anymore. I could be wrong. So 1 out of 1,000 refers to something very specific for a population that's so big. It's 200 million people. It's deliberate exclusion. To what end? So we are told by Deen Dayal Upadhyay in 1965, he made a speech in Pune where he said that the aim of the Janasangh and the BJP later was the political defeat of Muslims. What would come after that, we don't know because he didn't say. But it seems to me that if that is the ideology, the BJP does have a sort of consistency and has had on this front. And it has been quite successful in this as well.
But at the same time, when you look at the earlier years, you look that the BJP is actually not as virulent in its propagation of anti-Muslim rhetoric as it is right now. You would see it talk about minority rights in its manifestos, which are written about, and also, strangely enough, in its early years, it opposed the First Amendment, which restricted the freedom of speech. So there was that, and also preventive detention. So it seems like in the initial years, the BJP seems to me like a much more inclusive party, which changes according to, I think it has to do with the people who lead the party and not that, or do you think that there's these hating ideology was always latent in the party and is just being expressed now because it's popular?
I'd say that there is a consistency of one sort, which is that in the previous versions of their manifestos, while they had opposed the First Amendment, they wanted freedom of speech to be absolute, they opposed preventive detention and so on. The consistency came out of the fact that the anti-Muslimness was always expressed. There was one manifesto in 1980 when the last one that they were a part of the Janata Party together, where Mr. Vajpayee was representing what would become the BJP, where there is reference to minority rights, but that's just a carry forward from the previous Janata Party manifesto. The BJP or the Janasangh has never really looked at minority rights from the point of view of civil liberties, from the point of view of constitutionalism. They've always expressed their opinion about the stake that minorities hold within the democratic polity from the point of view of what they call appeasement. So for them, not only is it fair for them to leave out Muslims from their valid stake in power, it is also wrong for Muslims to stand up and ask for that stake in power because of what the BJP believes is the original sin, which is 1947 and partition. So though for a few years they had expressed some liberal ideas fleetingly, never really held on to them. They have always been consistent on the issue of minorities and particularly Muslims.
So is that the defining factor in like BJP's ideology? Like, would you say, like, it seems to me like you're reducing the entire ideology of BJP to, being anti-Muslim?
So I don't think it would be easy for us to narrow down on what their ideology is. So to get into the details of what I referred to earlier, they've had manifestos in which they've for a 20-year period till under Mr. Vajpayee, where they've said that the monthly income of all Indians should be limited to 2,000 rupees. That doesn't sound like like a party that is economically liberal. They opposed automation in all industry except defense and aerospace, which doesn't sound like a modern forward-looking party, which is what many of its supporters believe it to be today. So if there is no primary consistency in that sort of thing, economics is where you would expect a party to have its meatiest worldview. Most parties in the modern world, especially when they set out to gain power, and particularly populist parties, they tend to have an economic platform is a very substantial chunk of what they say. That's not the case with the BJP, and it's never been. The route that they keep coming back to is issues. The three issues that the BJP itself said were its central plank were: A, that Muslims should not have their autonomy in Kashmir, that Muslims should not have their own personal law, and third, that Muslims, beg your pardon, should not have that mosque in Ayodhya. So these were the three planks on which the party's popular vote was built. None of these three has anything to do other than being sort of anti-Muslim in its slant. So I would say it's accurate to say that if the BJP has one thing going for it in terms of consistency of ideology, it is its anti-Muslim opposition.
No, it's strange because usually when it comes to, parties which aim to unify one religious group against the other, usually they tend to be the religious conservative kind. And it does not seem to me that the BJP is particularly that, or that its ideological, adherents, those who started the ideology, were actually that conservative. Because there are different strands of Hindutva. Savarkar seems like, much more virulently anti-caste, even than Gandhi in many instances. Golwalkar has a much traditionalist view. So you see these different strands of the ideology come up. So do you think that the BJP or the Hindutva ideology is a conservative ideology, a religious conservative ideology? What is the lens through which you place it in this sort of social sector?
So it can express itself conservatively, but not all the time. And the problem is that India, the faith in India cannot be expressed conservatively, because to conserve what the texts say would be against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So if we look at Nepal, Nepal's Hindu Rashtraness was limited to only one aspect of Manusmriti, which is that executive power flowed from a Kshatriya king, and that's it. There was nothing else about the Manusmriti that they could replicate, and they couldn't replicate. You can't say in the world of 2022 that Shudras like the Patels, which I come from, will not be allowed to read. You can't say that women can't do this. You can't say that only Brahmins can do certain things. Though it is the fact, of course, that only Brahmins do certain things in India, such as the rites and rituals and so on. But to extend conservative textual dogma to society through politics is not possible in our time in the world, and therefore the BJP doesn't do it. It is true also that in some senses, what Golwalkar said about the fact that Brahmins ought to control the balance between the merchant and the warrior, which is what the RSS has done for decades through the Brahmin, continues. So where it is possible for them to express themselves conservatively in the textual sense, they do. But for the most part, they can't. You cannot have large numbers of Hindus voting for you, whether a minority is actually Brahmin or Vash. You do need the support of the Shudra, of the OBC, and for that you can't say to them that we'll treat you in the same way that the Smritis actually require us to.
So another thing that is consistent in the BJP manifesto is the idea of minority appeasement. So the idea that the reason we're forming the BJP and we need to solidify the Hindu identity is because the governments don't care about Hindus. They appease the minorities who are given privileged rights. So, how true is that, and where does this feeling arise from?
So we've already seen politically there is absolute exclusion. I don't see in my lifetime a Muslim becoming prime minister, and there was no chance of that happening before us either. The longest serving chief minister of any state who is a Muslim has been 2 years and a bit, which is Antule in Maharashtra. If we leave Kashmir aside, Kashmir is not a democratic space any longer and is ruled directly from Delhi. So politically, they are not being appeased. We can see the data on that. There is a study that the government put out about a decade ago by Justice Sachar, which looked at data elsewhere. How much of a stake do Muslims have in the economy? How much of a stake do Muslims have in government jobs, in the army? Muslims are banned from recruitment in RAW, which most people may or may not know. So
Banned in what way? Like in the legal sense?
RAW doesn't hire Muslims.
How? I mean, is it like a written code or?
No, it's not, and it doesn't need to be. But there was a report in Outlook where they spoke to former RAW chiefs who said that it's true. There's a chief called A.S. Abdullah who wrote a book 4 or 5 years ago on his experiences as a RAW chief, and he's the one quoted as saying that it's true. In all of signals, in all of the IB, in all of RAW, there is one Muslim officer who sits in IB. There's nobody else. So this is the data that such a report throws up. So we have to ask ourselves, what does appeasement then mean? And how is it that Muslims are being appeased? And the answer to that is that they're not. Just like things that are claimed, such as forced conversion, there's never been anybody who's been convicted of forced conversion in our history. Like love jihad, which the BJP has told Parliament doesn't exist because there is no definition of it. Just in that sense, this appeasement is a word that is used but doesn't really exist.
I think the two examples that the BJP will cite, the right wing is going to cite, is the Saabanu case and the separate civil laws for different religions.
So civil laws are separate for all faiths. So the Hindus have their own civil laws. I don't see how having separate civil laws is appeasement.
But because you have, the Hindu code is decently more liberal than the Muslim civil code. So
that's not true. I think that the thing on which the Hindu conservatives in the Congress opposed the Hindu code bill was two things basically. One is inheritance that went to daughters and to widows, and they didn't want that to happen. That had to liberalize at some point. Islam, because it is contractual in nature, so marriage in Islam is not a sacrament; it is a contract, which is why they can divorce much more simply than other communities can. They always have had a tradition where you have female participation in the assets. You could argue that it's not equal, nor is it in the case of the Hindu law. So I'm saying that the separating of civil law doesn't mean appeasement. Well, you could say, okay, all of us should have the same law. Let's make that argument. I'm saying that if civil law has to be the same, what sort of civil law should it be? Should we stop, say, polyandry or polygamy because we feel it's morally incorrect? Polygamy was more prevalent in the Hindu faith, data shows, and has been sort of historically. And I don't have a specific problem with that. If three people choose to live together, as you know, husband and two wives, or two husbands and one wife, as the Pandavas showed, what is the problem that somebody else would have with that? I don't think that is an indicator of appeasement. I think that the debate has been centered around polygamy with the view that this is what is disturbing the population, but there is no data to show that.
Yeah, but it's legally permitted for a certain section of the population, but not for the other section of the population. So,
I think that if that is the primary objection, you should fix it for the other side of the population.
Well, I think that the state should not recognize, as someone who has libertarian sympathies, I think that the state should not recognize any kind of marriage at all.
Fair enough. I think that these are things that I think by the time you're close to my age, these will not be discussed, because I think the progress of the world towards what you would recognize as being libertarian or being liberal is so rapid that how people lead their lives and so on, and who they choose to call partner or how many of them, is not going to be relevant for too long a period.
Right. So, and the Saabanu case.
So I think that the idea of, like, I don't know what the appeasement there is. I think the primary objection that some people might have is that the government legislated a law that overturned a Supreme Court judgment that some Muslims felt had gone against their personal law. Okay. So, I mean, I don't know what the specific issue there would be. The denial of alimony, I think, is a particularly uh, is a is a specific issue that we should look at in terms of the contract. Is it the case that outside of Shabano or outside of the Muslim personal law, mm, alimony and separations are happening with the kind of fairness that they should? My answer to that would be probably no, that we don't, as a society, we don't have the ability to be able to govern through the state such things. Um, yeah, so I think, like, I don't know too many people who are still going on about Shabano and saying that, this is what ought to have been. The malice shows in the triple talaq case, that once the Supreme Court had held the pronouncement of triple talaq as invalid, there was no reason for Parliament then to criminalize it. So we've got a situation where a Muslim man can be punished for something that did not happen, which is that the marriage is still intact. Divorce has not really happened, but the accusation that those three words are said will lead to 3 years in jail.
So, I mean, is this sort of discrimination actually systemic, or is it like just rhetoric? Like, is it the sense of raising communal hatred and identity for votes, or is it written into the law?
So I think it's written into the law for the most part. So if you look at, say, a possession of beef on which the burden of proof has been reversed, and there was a man in Gujarat in 2019 who was sentenced to 10 years in jail because he was accused of serving beef at his daughter's wedding. And the police could not prove that the meat was beef. And so the judge sentenced him saying that if we can't prove it, you have to show it, which is the reversal of burden of proof. It also applies to the 6 BJP states. Karnataka was the 6th and latest and the first southern state to get this law post 2018, which limits the rights of Christians in terms of propagation further. It also more or less bans interfaith marriages in India. So even if an adult woman were to say that she converted of free volition, that is insufficient proof for the state. So it is the man she's marrying into and his family that must prove that there was no coercion on her. And the state has the ability to undo the marriage, including marriages that have children. This, I think, is legal. So this is persecution that's happening through law. And these two are not the only instances. CAA is another space where we were told by the Home Minister that it is one part of a pincer, the other one being the NRC, which is specifically aimed at Muslims. So India has gone in the post-2014 space into new territory where the law is being used officially and constitutionally to persecute its minorities.
But none of this is like unconstitutional, because it seems to me like our constitution is severely flawed, and we have had, well, free speech laws from the beginning due to the First Amendment restricting and permitting laws which can only be seen as similar to that of blasphemy laws, and restricting free speech and UAPA and preventive detention acts. All of these that the government is utilizing now has always been present. It's only the case that different governments utilize it for different purposes. So the previous government, like the Congress, might have utilized it against, say, people like Arundhati Roy or communists and Maoists. This government is utilizing against students and Muslims. So it's only the target that changes, but the root of the problem, I think, remains the same, which is that the flaw that is already that has been there since the founding in our constitution and our laws.
Yes, I would say that that's pretty accurate. That the one that the a problem doesn't lie so much in the use of the law as the laws themselves, and this would extend to the things that I spoke about previously, which is um, the the uh, the a prohibition of propagation. So a propagation is both a criminal offense in India and a fundamental right. So that makes no sense, but that's the way it is. That India set out to do things in its constitution which it can't really deliver through law. And what has happened is that over time, and starting right at the beginning as well, the state, having made very bold promises to itself and to the people, began to claw back many of the rights that it had given, so that the rights of the state are supreme over the rights of the citizen.
But I don't see any opposition parties or any political party, reaching out to these systemic problems. I don't, even like in liberal circles, I don't see people talking out against things like 295A or the problem with the laws. Sometimes they will talk about UAP or sedition, and the next day, like the Congress party would talk about curtailing sedition laws, and then it would apply sedition laws in states that it rules. So it doesn't seem like the liberal elite in India has done enough or put enough pressure to ensure that these laws actually go away. It seems like the problem is only about one party versus the other, my group against yours. So when my group comes to power, it uses the same laws to do what your group did against mine. So that seems to be what's been happening since a long time.
That's true. I don't think that constitutionalism and the law form any basis of the political debate in India. And that is what I meant when I said that the debate is fairly primitive, and the association of the individual with the polity is also quite basic. It's at the level at which fairly tribal societies operate. Does that mean that in the absence of debate these changes will not come? I think they will come. I think that the things that we just spoke about will sort of require only a few years to go away. But one thing that we may not have considered is that you don't need these laws for the state to misbehave. India is not a rule of law state. The state can do whatever it wants, whether that is within the framework of the law or not, including kill people. You've got people in UP who are shot uh, in the knee for being accused of cow slaughter or cow theft, or whatever that is. Without there's no trial, of course. So to expect that the state would behave itself if these laws did not exist, or if these laws went back to their sort of pure form, where you don't have the first amendment restricting the rights, I think would be quite naive. That it's not the law itself that the state follows. The state follows its will, and its will is quite nasty and negative for the most part. So to some extent, it would be right for one set of people to say, oh, it's who is controlling the state that really matters, not the laws. That is how the state functions in our part of the world. Long term, I believe both these things will change. By long term, I mean 20 years from now. That I don't think that we'll have restrictions on freedoms to the extent that we do now. And I don't think the state will be able to get away with the kind of violations. The state is the biggest violator of the law in this country, and I don't think that will stay the case for too long.
How much of this do you think has to do with the people, the masses just, wanting such a state? Because it seems to me like India is not a completely industrialized society. It still retains some feudal elements. And in that context, its people are also, we have that kind of identity debates, and elections are won in the case of identity, and we have lynchings, which happen across the board. People are not just lynched for being belonging to another religion, they're also lynched for small acts like thieves, stealing or something like that. Even in Odisha recently, an incident happened in Bhubaneswar, like the capital city. So how much of it do you think has to do with the fact that the masses do not really want or are not really expressing the need for uh, that kind of freedom? They are fine with the state curtailing their rights.
I don't think anybody doesn't want freedoms, but let's ask ourselves how many within our sort of immediate family have also read the constitution or know what the rights are, or in what sense they are restricted. This is usually the subject of scholarship and things like that. This is not a popular debate. Do people want the right to express themselves freely? Obviously, and they do. I think in any anarchic society, which is what we are, the law will kick in only when the state has a specific interest in the law kicking in. It doesn't kick in on its own. You can have all the freedom of expression you want today if you belong to a particular set of people. You can say whatever you want. You can call for murder, and there would not be any kind of a state action against you. On the other hand, you could not actually say anything offensive and still be in jail. So it's not just about the fact that people don't know what the constitution contains, and I'm not talking just about the masses, I'm saying generally speaking, it's about the fact that the relationship that the state has to the laws, it needs to be restricted in a way that is not. And I think most people understand that, even if they might not understand specifically what the constitution's um, you know um, um, uh, words are, but they do understand that the control of the state in a particular way is negative, and often it's aimed against them. This I think you would find in common across the population.
Let me give you one example of a recent incident that happened in Punjab, the lynchings. So, from both the sides, both the political parties, instead of condemning the lynching, the first thing that they did was condemn the blasphemy that occurred. So, the reason they did that was because they wanted vote, and it seems to the majority of people were more aghast at the so-called blasphemy than they were at the lynching. So there were talks of increasing the blasphemy laws and that blasphemy is becoming more prevalent. This was the debate instead of it being about the murder of someone inside the premises of a holy temple. So I think this is just one example of how the masses really want these uh, blasphemy laws, these restrictions on speeches. Uh, I do think that you can find Hindus, for instance, who will be totally fine with doing defaming Prophet Muhammad or making cartoons or whatever, but they will not be fine with that being happening to them, and same with the Muslim community. So everyone wants the right to express, their own themselves, but they don't want the same to happen to them. In other words, these laws are actually seem to have a sort of popular ascent. People really are not that fired up against them.
Yeah, so if we look at Pakistan, there were only, I think, 7 cases of blasphemy that were recorded under all of unified India and Pakistan in the British period up to about the mid-80s in Pakistan. But after Zia passed a law which raised the death penalty, which raised the sentence on blasphemy to death, Pakistan has the same penal code that we do. So he had to just tweak that law. Suddenly, the number of people being accused of blasphemy went up into the hundreds each year. And they would often get lynched. So it is the case that often the state pushes a particular law or a particular policy, and then society responds through violence, which otherwise was not actually occurring on the ground. That there are heightened tensions within society that are stirred up by the state deliberately through legislation. Um, I would agree with you. I think that we don't know whether had a party actually opposed the murder of that individual, they would have suffered. I mean, that we can only theorize that they feel that they might lose votes if they speak out on that strongly enough. But it seems to be the case to me that what you're saying is right, that that all parties felt in that particular instance that speaking out in favor of rule of law or in favor of justice would actually take away from their popularity rather than add to it.
Right. So, well, I want to talk about Modi because that's your most recent book. And I want to start by asking you about whether you think, between the Vajpayee government and the Modi government, what are the continuities and what are the discontinuities between the two regimes?
So the Vajpayee government was a product of its time, and its time in between the mid 90s and the close of his last term, his third term, I think it was in 2004, the third time he was sworn in, I should say, was that it was a decade of coalitions that you had. Even before it, you had the Congress in a minority government, leading a minority government. Then you had two people from the Janata Dal leading for brief periods minority governments. Then you had the BJP, which had only, I think at peak it was about 190 or something like that seats. I can't quite remember what they got in 1999. But so they were dependent on their allies, and it was the antics of the allies that to a large extent defined those years as well. Whether it was the DMK, it was Mamta Banerjee, it was George Fernandez and his party, the Shiv Sena, obviously. Here, it's in that sense, it's more stable. That there are very few things stopping Mr. Modi from doing what it is that he seeks to do, either from external sources also. Though the government is said to be an NDA government, the BJP on its own has a majority and has had for both its terms. So there is no reliance on external partners who cannot say that we want this or you can't do that. So that's the first part. The second part is that I think in terms of the economy, things were quite well managed by the Vajpayee government. If one were to go by what the pink papers say, that the bringing in of fiscal responsibility comes through an act that was passed by him. The idea that the state should not be running all these public sector units goes back to him trying to sell hotels and things like that. Telecom obviously really flourished in the period that he was in. I think at this point, I would say that we are in the 8th year of Mr. Modi's rule, and we are closing in on year 9. I don't see that kind of consistency of thinking that what began or what was promised by those people who believed that they knew Mr. Modi's mind was something far more liberal than we have today. And there is news today that the government's picked up a stake in Vodafone rather than let it go bust. So that doesn't seem to me to gel with what Mr. Modi has said about the government not having business to be in business. So I find the lack of consistency there. I also think that because of his allies and because of other reasons, Vajpayee was reluctant to push with the kind of intensity the Hindutva bits of law that Mr. Modi has. That Vajpayee was not able to as confidently express his Hindutvaness as uh, uh, Mr. Modi did then and does now. So I think that has left an imprint on the country and on the government, which we are seeing, which is quite distinct from what we saw in the 1998 to 2004 period.
What do you think is the reason behind the contradiction between what Mr. Modi says and what he does? So he advocated for liberal policies and liberal economic policies, the government has no business doing business, or posted about ease of business, doing ease of business rankings and things like that. But then you also see the government steeped in the same sort of social welfare schemes and same economic, worse economic outcomes than the previous one.
So I think because he hasn't written a text himself, we don't really know what he feels or thinks. There is no coherent text that he's written which tells us that this is his worldview in terms of the economy and what he seeks to do with it. We have been told by others who say that they are either speaking on his behalf or are divining his mind. So he has only done things like coining acronyms and giving us statements like government has no business to be in business. But is that supposed to be just some quip, or is that supposed to be a fundamental tenet, or we don't know. So which gives him the space to be able to do what he wants at the point at which he chooses to do it. And that's the way he's gone about it. I suppose he has disappointed those people who felt that this was going to be some kind of extremely liberal kind of a Chile type of a situation where you had economists who would set the country right. That is clearly not happened, and most of them have sort of run away. The people from starting with Panagaria, who has been quoted several times as saying that he's disappointed with the turn that this government has taken on the side of economics, particularly on protection and trade, which is one place they felt uh, that India could have done a lot better than it has.
So you talk about him being a decisive leader, and that kind of plays into his style of leadership, and you emphasize on how that's actually not necessarily a good thing. So, well, I have questions on that, but first, can you please talk briefly about what you mean by calling Modi a decisive leader, and what is the style of leadership?
So he decides, which is what decisive means. Doubt is usually the sign of a refined intellect. That if you feel that you don't really uh, see clarity in front of you, you are comfortable sort of expressing doubt, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And you might not decide something or on a particular course of action if you feel that there is turbulence or insufficient evidence to show that this is what the outcome will be. Whereas somebody who's decisive is more likely to be able to take that decision because they are coming not from the point of view of doubt, but from the point of view of certitude, that they believe that they're doing the right thing or what they think is the right thing. And he's one of those people that who can take a decision based on the fact that he feels it's right, rather than look at and sort of examine and dwell deep into what the problems are and what the potential issues might be. And I'm saying this not because I'm a psychologist or I'm trying to divine his mind, but this is what he has said himself. And in his own words, he says that he doesn't read files, that he cannot govern through what he calls academic studies, and he only seeks a 2-minute brief from the people that surround him, his bureaucrats, and then he takes a call. And we have two specific examples that show us what sort of happens when he chooses to be decisive. The first is demonetization, and the ministers, the cabinet was summoned on that day. I think it was the 8th of November, and they were told to leave their phones behind. So they didn't know that this was coming. Their departments didn't know, and their ministries didn't know, and therefore the government didn't know, and the government didn't have time to prepare. And we saw the result. The second was that the BBC filed more than 200 RTIs to ask the government, including things like the department that was running disaster management and the finance ministry, who had been consulted before the national lockdown of 2020. And the answer was nobody. That nobody in government knew that this was coming, and it was announced that night, and we saw the fallout of that as well. So that is what I mean by this sort of decisive style that doesn't examine fallout, doesn't go into the details, but wants to take a firm and strong decision, which is what he has done.
Well, that's a strong claim to make, and it's concerning because, when you think about it, that the prime minister of the country takes decisions that affect billions of citizens on the basis of 2-minute briefs.
These are his words, so we can only assume that he's speaking the truth.
Well,
And it shows, I think, that those who have looked at the last 7-8 years, the polity does show signs that this is the way the country is run.
yeah, but that's very takes time to settle in. So when we,
not,
but that
not
decisiveness, I think that, calling him decisive doesn't really make sense in some instances, because well, we have one example like of 2002, the riot that happened, and in Anwesh Satpathy's book, he comes out as a very indecisive, bumbling politician, and the same, and we have seen that pattern repeated again and again and again through the Delhi riots that happened, through the farmers' protests. So he's clearly not very decisive in those instances.
He is actually. I don't know why you should say that. In the farmers' instance, he was extremely decisive. He passed a law which was actually done during the pandemic, in the midst of the lockdown, passed as ordinances. He stood by his, he rammed the law through without a division vote in the Rajya Sabha, knowing it would cause political trouble. That I would say is a sign of decisiveness. He stood by his law for a year. I'm sure the entire party was saying, please go back. He sort of refused for no reason. Once those farmers had mobilized on the outskirts of Delhi, anybody who understands the first thing about democratic politics knew that the game was over. Once you have 50,000 people mobilized on the road, those laws are dead. He knew that as well, I'm sure. But he chose not to go back on them for a year. 600, 700 of them died. He didn't care. That I would say is decisiveness. I met him in 2002. I don't agree that he was bumbling in 2008. He knew exactly what he was doing. We spent, I and two others, both of whom are now dead, Padgaonkar and Varghese, we went as part of the Editors Guild, and we spent some time with him. And I spent some time with him after that as well. I don't think that he saw himself as being bumbling or sort of indecisive, and he did not come across that way to me. I think that where you could say reasonably that, well, he seems to have, he doesn't know what to do. He looks away from the problem there, which was, I think, what like happened in the instance of the farmers, what happened with CAA, that he just refused to acknowledge that there was a problem and hoped that it would go away, which it did, thanks to COVID. And what is sort of happening in Ladakh, where he can ignore it and look away, but he doesn't accept either to his people, and perhaps not even to himself, maybe, I don't know, that he's done something which would be seen as a sign of weakness, or done something that would be wrong. He's full of satisfaction at the way he functions, and there is never any contrition that he offers on the things that he's done. The farmers, pulling the farmers' laws back, saying that, he kept saying that this is a small section of farmers we were not able to convince. That's not true. But that's the way he saw it.
Well, I think that's more terrifying, because being indecisive means he's not able to take a decision, but saying that he knows what's going on, but lets it go on anyway, lets people die, that means he's malevolent.
I think he is, to a large extent, and I don't think he considers the fact that people died. How many, think about this, on the stroke of midnight that day in November 2016, how many women were exploited because they didn't know what had happened a few hours or few minutes before that, and only had a few of the old currency notes to convert? This is a part of the world where people are exploited regularly for being vulnerable. He didn't care. People were dying in the queues. He didn't care. He cried for himself when he came He ran away from the public space for 20 days after he cancelled his rally in Bengal. It's impossible to imagine such a thing happening today because he's always on TV, always somewhere else giving us a lecture. He was nowhere to be seen for 3 weeks when people were dying of a lack of oxygen in Delhi. He should have rolled up his sleeves and gone into the hospitals and tried to do what he could. He didn't. He just ran away. He would rather not face himself or his self-image than concede that he's done something wrong or concede that he's weak at this point in time. That's the kind of person he is. He's full of himself. Solipsism, that's the word, that the world consists of little else apart from the self. I think he tends to define that term.
So are you saying that he's more motivated by his self-image than by ideology?
Would you wear your name on a suit? Anwesh Satpathy, would you wear that in gold pinstripes and go before the president of the US? Would you speak about yourself in the third person to your mother? Anwesh ko aaj ye chahiye, Anwesh ko ye nahi kaam karna. You and I don't speak like that because we are normal. Somebody who refers to themselves all the time in the third person, who wears their name on a suit, like there is something very seriously different about such a person than most of us. This is a man of destiny who thinks he is a man of destiny, who believes so, and who tells us that he is. He ought to be studied much more closely than he has been in a democratic polity. But that's because we are the kind of nation we are. That had this been another democracy, somebody with this sort of manner of functioning would be looked at in a very a close way, which I think he has escaped.
But it has worked for him. I mean, he's...
Little question. I think he's the most popular charisma. I would be very surprised if somebody were to show, which you can't show, but if somebody were to tell me that Nehru was more popular than Modi, or even Gandhi was more popular than Modi, I would be surprised. Because I think that what the people hold for him, they can carry to passion. I don't think with Gandhi or with Nehru, people would take up cudgels for them with the kind of intensity that they do when they stand up for Mr. Modi.
So do you think that he is more motivated to win votes, or is he more motivated to sort of, I don't know, demonize? Do you think that the demonization of Muslims or the rhetoric that's going on is simply a byproduct of him wanting to get votes, or is it like really embedded?
It is. He holds that is a core belief. I think for him, a vote is just an instrumental way of securing power. He could do without the votes. His popularity doesn't come from the fact now that he has X number of the vote. His popularity comes out of the fact that his charisma is acceptable. That many Indians think that he's the right sort of leader. If he were to declare a sort of emergency tonight at 8 o'clock and take over charge of the state fully, I don't think there would be too much resistance from his own supporters. They would be fine with it. They might even want him to do it.
I recently saw an article that came in from a new book. So it was based on Pew polls, I think, and found out that more people in India are fine with army rule than in Russia and Pakistan.
Yeah, so I'm not surprised because firstly, I think Pew polls tend to be online and they tend to be on phone. So the kind of constituency and the sample size will need to be looked at. But it would not surprise many of us to be told that, the middle class wants a strong leader, and democracy is bad because these poor people and illiterate people have a vote. So that's been a common theme throughout the democratic politics of our country. And I don't think it would surprise anybody to know that if he were to declare a sort of national emergency of some sort tonight, there would be very little resistance from within his own side.
But it makes you wonder what the end goal is. What does say the
Whatever.
achievement of Hindu Rashtra, something like that.
Let's take two specific things. Let's take communism. So the end goal, you could say, sort of philosophically, is the withering away of the state, etc. But how do you get there? You get there through the state control over the economy, and the state controls everything, etc., and so on. So that's a specific thing that the state can go out and do. You can the state has tried to do it in large parts of the world and failed. But that there is an end goal there, right? Hindutva doesn't. There is no end goal. It has never been expressed. There is nothing within the Hindutva framework in their texts which tell us that this is what the end state is. What is the Hindu Rashtra? Does it mean that we are rid of all the Muslims plus we have the textual definition of politics according to dharma, which is Brahmins in a particular space, Kshatriyas in a particular space, and Shudra? Even the BJP would say no to that. That's not what they mean. So what do they want? Other than the brutalization and the marginalization of minorities, particularly Muslims, there is no other goal, and that is why this is what will continue. So long as the BJP in power, every day we'll have something new. You can't pray there today. You can't eat this tomorrow. You can't sell this food on the street the third day. You can't own this business if you're a Muslim. Every day there'll be something else of this sort. There's nothing else.
So this is just state bullying an entire system.
The thing about the BJP is that it has evolved and democratized this to society, as it has done in Gujarat successfully. So the Dharm Sansad in Haridwar is a manifestation of it. We'll see this in all parts. We are seeing this in society itself. And society itself does what the BJP wants done to minorities, particularly Muslims, which is exclude, which is, harass. And that is all there is to this. There's nothing else in Hindu Rashtra.
But don't you think that this was latent in society, and all that the BJP has done is ensure that it's easier to say it in more open spaces?
You're right. I think what they've done is only catalyze something that is latent. But I think catalyzing something that is latent is also an action. It's an act that you choose to do. It's very difficult in our part of the world where society is quite fragile to push a pluralism, to push rule of law, and to try and do it. Because this is hard stuff. This is the hard part of governance, trying to enforce rule of law. It's easier to say, to gang up on to do the 80-20 thing that Yogi Adityanath speaks of. Let the 80% vote constantly against the 20%. To what end? We don't know. But there is no end. This is the end. You just keep voting against your own minorities, and don't let things like GDP, jobs, and the price of petrol become the subject of debate. Your focus should be on what the Muslims should and shouldn't be doing, and what should and should not be done to them.
Where do we go from here?
I think modernity is quite a powerful thing, and it tends to be very intolerant of nonsense. So if you step back, I was born in '69, which was only 5 years and a century away from the civil war in the US, right? So that's in the 1860s. So 101 century before I was born, man could own man, and man could own child, and woman could own child and do what they wanted with their child. The year I was born, man landed on the moon. So in that century, what happened? So you had decolonization, that you had large societies become democratic spaces with their own constitutions. Women got the vote, including in Switzerland, where they didn't have it. Man made many things, including some things that he used to kill himself on scale. But if you look at the history of rights in the last 150 years, it's all moved towards what we would call the liberal space. Who can you marry? Who can you love? Can you have an abortion? Do you have control over your own body? Can you be sold as an individual? On all these questions, what we would consider as being the liberal side has won. And that will continue because it is inevitable. The march of human history is inexorably towards what you and I would see as being, as some would call left, some would call liberal. But it is away from the fact that people want to control what other people do, which is what Hindutva seeks to do. You can't keep that mosque. You can't have your autonomy in Kashmir. You can't have your personal law. You can't eat that. You can't pray there, and so on. That kind of nonsense, I think, doesn't really survive. So I give it about 20 years, but this will be externally forced on us. This will not be the result of some great awakening of the Indian people. I think we are quite happy with the way things are. And we tend not to punish mistakes or stupidity in politics because we tend not to think of them as being mistakes and stupidity. So while I am an optimist in the long term, and by long term I mean the 20-year space, I don't think that this optimism comes out of any sense that we'll do it, we'll go about it ourselves. I think it'll be forced on us.
Maybe by judiciary, maybe by
Judiciary
legislation.
also us. There is no chance that I see the judiciary doing any of this or of it being relevant. You can pass whatever law you want in India. It doesn't make a difference. If the state can kill you, I don't know if you saw the story of the man in UP who was picked up, and we were told that they would kill him, and he was picked up in another city. They were transporting him to UP and they killed him with the entire world watching. They didn't care. That's the way it is. That the law means absolutely nothing in this country. The government can do what it wants, and there's nothing to stop it. It could lie to Parliament. It could lie to the Supreme Court. Begged the government to come clean on a Pegasus. The government is spying. The accusation is on a sexual harassment victim of a former Supreme Court Chief Justice. The government said no, get lost, and the Supreme Court did get lost. They went and formed a committee which has gone back to the victims now to say, now prove that you've been hacked. So the government, the Supreme Court, I have no illusion that this will come to us because of some great judge taking charge of the Supreme Court.
Well, I mean, that's a bleak note, but
I hope not. I think that the future is good. I think that the future of the world is great. That there'll be less violence, more freedom. I think for a brief period, for about 10-15 years, economically it'll be very tough because we are transitioning through that one phase in our history where it becomes impossible to do the old thing, which is send large numbers of people into a middle income through manufacturing and things like that. I think that era is behind us. And given that, I think for the next 10-15 years, we'll see a lot of hardship in a lot of countries, including ours. But in 20 years' time, I think it'll be very good.
yeah, well, let's hope that the moral arc bends towards justice and progress. Let's hope that Steven Pinker is right. On that note, Mr. Patel, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, Anwesh.